I don't agree with the last speaker that extending the time limit is the only thing we can do. We could indeed scrap the current tribunal structures and listen to the 221 plus women who pulled out of talks with you, Minister, because they weren't being listened to. The fact that this bill tonight exists at all is, in my view, an admission by the government and by the Minister that the original Act has failed. If the Act had succeeded in its aims, it shouldn't be necessary to extend the deadline. The extension is an admission of failure, and an extension in time will not address that failure. It hasn't failed because of COVID or time delays for any other outside event. It failed because the Act and the Tribunal itself failed the women affected, just as the state has largely, since the start of this scandal, failed those women. It's astonishing to me that this House passed the original Act in July 2019, yet 2 years later, just 5 women have applied to it. When this Act was introduced, the opposition, including yourself, Minister, warned Simon Harris that it was seriously flawed, that it was exclusive to some victims, that it risked being over-adversarial, excluded victims' families, didn't offer the supports needed to them, and didn't allow for subsequent claims for compensation in the cases of recurrence of cancer. The Act has spectacularly failed in its stated aim to provide a fast, cheaper, less adversarial route for women affected, and the Minister's insistence on proceeding with it, despite the concerns of the 22 plus group, is an example of how, yet again, the state has failed to listen to the women affected. In fact, when you think about it, Vicky Phelan's case was starting today. She would not be eligible to apply to this tribunal. Indeed, most of the household names that we're now familiar with would not be eligible to go before this tribunal. But it's clear that the labs involved have actively resisted progressing cases in the court and have tried to delay progressing those cases. There is nothing, unfortunately, to suggest that this tribunal will be any different or less adversarial, and I think this is one reason why, and only one reason, why women have failed to seek to have their cases heard there. It's bitterly ironic that the present trends, the tribunal is more likely to spend a multiple of state funds on itself rather than on the women affected by the screening failures. Unless the tribunal is informed in line with what the 22 plus women are quite reasonably asking for, it will continue to be a failure. The fact is that the fears of many of us about this tribunal have been proven correct. It isn't about the state making amends to the women affected, it's about the state following through on its apology. It's about the state circling the wagons and ensuring secrecy over its failures. I note that 2 of my amendments have been ruled out of order on the grounds of costs. Ironically, the purpose of them was to widen and make the tribunal more open to women affected who are not included in the 221 plus or the RCOG groups. I'd like to ask the Minister how you intend to address that issue, given that when in opposition, you seem to agree with these concerns. When we discussed the original Act, you shared our concerns on this. I just want to make some general comments on the cervical check scandal. Women affected by the scandal, and some of us who have raised it continually in here, have had to listen continually to an avalanche of commentators and experts explaining to us that screening programs are not diagnostic, that they are not perfect, that it's perfectly natural to miss some discordant slides. Women have been talked down to, told that they are raising concerns and threatening the very screening programs that have saved thousands of lives. And if legal claims continue, we were warned that the poorer labs would have to withdraw from providing the vital service. Shut up and move on has been the hidden and not so hidden message. The women affected know exactly what the natural limitations of screening are, and so do I. We don't need that repeated. Screening is not a diagnostic check. There will be natural and unavoidable errors in screening. False negatives can mean very different things depending on the actual smear. Some false negatives are not negligent, and there are different grades of errors in each individual test. I and other women understand that, but we also know what negligence is, and the cervical check scandal is about negligence. That is why multinational corporations have paid out millions, and that is why the HSE and the state have apologised, because negligence has cost lives. And the question remains unanswered. How did this happen? From the start, I believed that the contracting out of the screening service to private for-profit labs in the US was a mistake, that competitive tendering for such a vital service was running down domestic and public control labs, and that doing this type of screening was a big mistake. Since the scandal broke, we've been repeatedly told there's nothing to see here, move on. The privatisation of the screening programme was not an issue. I've had ministers and the HSE get angry at me at committee stages for suggesting that there are any connections. But let me just recap. At no stage have the state seemed interested in why catastrophic errors made by private labs while conducting a service on behalf of the state, why that happened. That in itself is astonishing. What we do know about the US labs as a result of the last 3 years is that lab screeners, for example, could examine 100 slides a day, whereas in the Irish labs, when we had them, the screening was between 30 and 60 screens a day. Screening is laborious, difficult work, and that's why the NHS and the HSE insist on a high level of qualification and put limits on how long examiners can work at it in one day. Some US labs didn't have ISO accreditation. US labs subcontracted cervical check to other labs. There were only 2 site checks of the US labs in the 10 years by the HSE. The level of false negatives from Ireland that were subsequently judged to contain high-grade abnormalities were astonishing. Quest Illinois had 5 times a higher incidence rate than the Coombe. Quest New Jersey had 4 times a higher incidence rate than the Coombe. CPL Texas had 7 times a higher incidence rate than the Coombe. I don't believe Minister Harris then, and I don't believe now, that the entire scandal that has shown devastating effects of the contracting out on vital public services, and I want to thank the 221 group who have fought to show this up. In order to get justice and answers, they have, despite their courage, their tenacity and their dignity, failed to get justice, and the extension of this tribunal by 1 day will not, by 1 day or even by the months that you're proposing, will not bring that justice any closer. The state has created an impression that this is a compensation tribunal. It is not. It's just as adversarial as the courts.